All right. Hello, Redeemer ladies. So I am trying to redo the video that didn't work for us on Saturday morning. Hopefully this one will work. We'll get it posted to YouTube. And those of you that were not able to join us on Saturday can watch this video. And then even those that maybe were there but kind of want a refresher, want to go over it again, this will be available to all of us. So I hope it's helpful to you. So I'm just going to jump in and get started. So just to introduce what we're doing this next semester for reflections, we are going to learn the skill of biblical theology, understanding how the Bible is one big story from Genesis to Revelation. The materials we're using for this semester, we have a binder here that the team has put together for you. On the inside of the binder, we have this page. A lot of this first two pages is what I'll be going over this evening. So this is kind of our intro to the Bible section. Then we have a resource page for different Bible reading apps, concordances, and some further study books in here. And then we also have worksheets for you to use as you do the different themes that we are doing over the next few months. So this is our resource that we're using. If you do not have one, please let me know. We have several extras made, and I'd be happy to get one to you. Okay? All right. So I'm going to jump right in. Okay? So to start off, I do not want to assume that we all know the same about the Bible or the same amount of information about the Bible. So I'm going to start with a little time of just kind of introducing the Bible, almost as if, we know nothing about it. So, okay. So the first question we're going to ask is, what is the Bible? So the Bible is made up of 66 books, and all of these books are put together to make up one book. Okay, it was written in 3 different languages. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew and Aramaic, and then the New Testament was written in Greek. It was written over a period of 1,500 years and spanned 3 different continents: Africa, Asia, and Europe. And it had approximately 40 different writers. They were kings, royalty, farmers, fishermen, a tent maker, homeless prophets, a doctor, musicians, and pastors. We had all these different people from different walks of life that wrote the Bible, but actually behind all of that, the Bible has one divine author, God Himself. Okay? The Bible is broken down into 2 parts. We have the Old Testament and then the New Testament. And then even within that, it's broken down into genres or styles, types. We have narrative, poetic, instruction, which would be the letters, apocalyptic, which is talking about the future or things to come. The first section we have is, and if you have your binder, you can follow along here. The first section we have is the law books. The first 5 books of the Bible are also called the Pentateuch. They're widely believed to have been written by Moses, most likely during the time that they were wandering in the wilderness. The Israelites were wandering in the wilderness after leaving Egypt. And Moses' purpose in writing these books was to tell them where they came from, why things are the way they are, or what went wrong, and where they're going, which is ultimately what the Bible is also telling us: where we came from, what went wrong, and where we're going. Then, after the book of law, or the law books, we have the history books. These books tell of the historical events of Israel, beginning right when they enter into the promised land in Canaan, through the kingdom of Israel, the split, to their exile and then eventual return from exile. Then we have the wisdom books, that's Job through Song of Solomon, and those are the most poetic books of all of the genres, and they're to be read for the most part as poetry. Then following that is the major and minor prophets. They all speak of Israel's sin and coming judgment. And the major, just as a side note, the major books are only the major books because they're longer. That's really what differentiates them. And then the minor books are much shorter, but they all have very similar messages. Okay. Then after that, we get into the New Testament. And the New Testament begins with the Gospels. The first 4 books are the Gospels. The Gospels tell of the birth, life and work, and death and resurrection of Christ. Then we have another history section in the book of Acts that talks about the beginning of the early church. And then we have the letters section, which takes up the majority of the New Testament. And these epistles or letters were written by apostles to instruct the church on how to be the church. And then the New Testament ends with the book of Revelation, which is a prophecy book. Revelation is apocalyptic, meaning that it's looking ahead at what is to come and things that have not yet happened. Okay? So even though the Bible has all of these different parts, authors, genres, it is still telling one big story. Okay. So I'm going to now kind of go through a little bit of the story of the Bible, just so you can kind of see that. Okay, so we're going to begin in Genesis chapter 1, where we have the creation story. This is where God created heaven and earth. Then in Genesis 3:15, the serpent tempts Eve, and Adam and Eve sin, and they rebel against God. Then in Genesis 6, we have we have Noah and the flood, which is a decreation and recreation. Okay, so the story of Noah, what happened with Noah, is very similar to creation. Remember, in creation, the Bible tells us that the waters parted and the dry land came up. Well, when we have in Noah, the story of Noah, he tells us that the waters came down and the waters rose. So we have a decreation. So God basically decreated, and then the waters dried out, and we have a recreation. And then Noah is sort of a new Adam. Okay? Then we get to Genesis 10, the Tower of Babel, where man is trying to make a name for himself. They talk about let's build a tower and see if we can get to God, and won't we be great, and all this stuff. And God disperses them. He basically says, no, that's not what I have for you. Now, here at the Tower of Babel is very similar to the sin of Adam and Eve in the beginning with eating the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. These were gifts that God he intended to give to his people. There's something he wanted to do and give them, but it had to be on his terms, not our terms, not when we wanted it or they tried to rise up and take what God was not yet giving to them. Okay, so that's what happened at the Tower of Babel. So then God disperses them and spreads them all out and gives them all new languages. Then we get to chapter 12 of Genesis, where God calls out Abram from his land and promises to make a name and a nation out of Abram at the time. Okay. Then after Abraham, we have the life of Joseph, and then Israel going into exile into Egypt because of the famine. We start in Exodus, and Moses leads the people out of Egypt, and they're wandering in the wilderness. After wandering, finally when we get to the book of Joshua, the nation of Israel finally enter into the promised land. And then we come to the book of Judges, where for most of the book of Judges, Israel is under a leadership crisis. They have mostly bad judges. Most of them do not follow the Lord. Then we get to Ruth, the book of Ruth. Ruth, who has Obed, who has Jesse, who then has David. Those are kind of the timeline, or the big things there. And then in 1st and 2nd Samuel, we have King David. And then we have King David, then to King Solomon, and King Solomon builds the temple. After Solomon, his son Rehoboam is ruling. Not so great, really just doesn't have much of a backbone, and Israel has a number of terrible kings that don't follow the Lord, and then the tribes split into Judah and Israel. Judah keeps the Davidic line and the temple. In Israel, the northern kingdom is still God's people at this point, but they're in a bad place. So God actually uses Assyria to come in and bring judgment to Israel, and they capture them and take them off into exile. Many years later, Judah kind of goes the same way, and Babylon comes in and captures Judah and takes them to exile. They eventually round up all of the nation of Israel, where they're actually, or the both kingdoms, and they're actually in exile together for about 70 years. Then we get to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, where the nation of Israel returned from exile. They get to go home. They're kind of set free by the Medes and the Persians. However, they're not really truly free, because at that point, then they're still highly taxed by those kingdoms. Okay. Then we get to the prophets. All of the prophets have the same message. They're telling the same message. They are accusing Israel of their sin, reminding them of their sin. They're speaking of the judgment that is to come, but then they're also giving a reassurance that God will save a remnant. And that is what we see through the whole Old Testament. Actually, anytime something happens, we see that God saves a remnant. He does not completely wipe his people off the face of the earth. Okay? Then after the prophets, the prophet books, we have 400 years of silence. And then Matthew 1. We start with a genealogy of Christ. Okay? Then Christ is born, Christ is crucified and resurrected. Then we have the ascension of Jesus. And Matthew 28, at the end of Matthew, tells us to make disciples of all nations. God again is dispersing them, but this time he's sending the message of Christ out to the nations. Then we have the book of Acts through Jude, and the purpose of those books is making disciples. They are gathering up God's people. And then in Revelation, we see the return of Jesus. He finally comes back for his people. And in Revelation 20 through 21, the very end of the Bible and the end of the book of Revelation, we see the new heaven and the new earth, the true, actual promised land. Okay? And that's basically in a nutshell, the storyline of the Bible. So what I basically just gave us was a list of events. That's kind of the very condensed highlight version of the plot of the Bible as a whole. So the plot is the series of events. But then in most literature and movies, there are what we call themes. Now, themes tell the central message of that book, what the author intended people to know or to understand in the midst of those stories. So let me practice with you and just show you a little bit of difference between the plot and the theme. I'm going to read a plot to a movie, and let's see if you can guess it. Okay? There was a man who had a wife and 2 small daughters. They lived in New York. The father, while working an office job for a larger company, longed to own his own business. He went to the bank to try to get a loan so that he can buy an old, run-down museum. He was turned down, so in desperation, he swindled his company to come up with the money to buy a wax museum. Before long, he shifts focus and begins to highlight unique and peculiar acts on the circus stage. Do you know what movie I'm talking about? If you guess The Greatest Showman, you'd be right. So that's the plot of The Greatest Showman. But can you tell me what some of the themes were of The Greatest Showman? What were some of the messages that were being sent through that story? I know you can't respond to me on the recording, so here are some. Be true to yourself. Make people happy. Family is more important than success. Okay, that's just 3 of the possible themes or messages that the movie was trying to get forth. And we see that in all good literature and all good movies. So we also see that in the Bible. Okay? So as I said, this semester, we're going to be studying biblical theology, which is looking at the Bible as one cohesive story. Now, this is different than systematic theology, which is looking at what the Bible says about a particular topic. Okay? The storyline of the gospel of the Bible, if you're following along in your page, is creation, fall or rebellion, redemption, and then consummation. And it's important to know that. I'm going to repeat it. Creation, fall and redemption, fall and rebellion, redemption, and consummation. And it's important that we know that because we will see it in Scripture as we are reading. It is the overlaying story of the Bible. But we also see it pop up in small ways around the Bible. So there's a chart in your resources that has kind of a mountain V like this. And I actually kind of wish I would have changed it a little bit so that it was reversed a little bit, so that it would be creation, fall and rebellion, redemption, and then consummation. Because ultimately, God's goal was not to just leave us at the beginning where redemption is, but he was always moving us from glory to glory. If Adam and Eve, if they had not sinned, and they did everything they were asked, and they obeyed the Lord faithfully, I still think that there would have been a moving up closer and being more glorified. And so that's the consummation here, okay? So, but anyway, that's the backstory of the Bible, the overarching story. And we're going to learn how to recognize symbols or themes that point back to this overarching story, okay? Biblical theology has been defined in a few different ways, but for our purposes here, we're going to go with D.A. Carson's explanation that it tracks themes that run throughout the whole of the Bible. They begin in Genesis 1 and find their finish in Revelations 20 and 21. And there are about 20 big themes. We're going to look at 10 of them together over the next several months. They're kind of like ligaments that hold the whole of the canon together. And the word canon is just a big word that means that's the accepted books of the Bible that have been agreed upon that make up the Bible. Okay. Nancy Guthrie also defines it, biblical theology, as a way of understanding that the Bible is really telling one cohesive story about what God is doing in the world through Christ. It's more about tracing particular themes that develop in the story of the Bible from creation to consummation. Okay? So, why study biblical theology? Well, I think that we are first and foremost beings of love or desire. We are thinking beings, but I think our first inclination is to love or to desire. Okay? Biblical theology catches our hearts and shows us what the good life looks like here and now, and what life will be like when Jesus returns. stories, narratives, poetry, they all shape our desire, and they cause us to want to be a certain kind of person or to worship a certain kind of king or Lord. Don't you feel that tug on your heart when you see a good movie or you read a good book? We aren't being led by our emotions, but we're going to be shaping them and informing them. Okay? And it's important because we're bombarded with other interpretations of what the good life should look like. And if we do not fill our minds with what the Bible tells us is good, we'll be fooled into thinking that what the world tells us is good is better. And the distractions of this world often make us forget about heaven or that life was intended to be something better than this. So we're reminding ourselves that we have a longing for heaven. We do. I think we've all been instilled with this longing for heaven. And oftentimes we get distracted or it gets numbed by either things being really good or we're just distracted. Our minds are distracted. We're busy. We find other ways to kind of satiate that longing or help us to forget about it. And I think that God uses two different things to remind us of that longing. One he uses is pain. He will allow pain into our lives to remind us that we were made for heaven. But also he uses beauty. Okay? And we're going to allow the beauty of the Bible to inform what we love and what we long for. So I hope that as we study these themes, we fall in love with Jesus and with his Bible. And I hope that we will be captivated by the life that God intends for us as we see how these themes play out. Okay, so that's a little bit of the what and the why. Okay, I'm going to give an example of what this looks like, tracing a theme from Genesis to Revelation, and I'm going to tell the story of the Bible through the theme of king or kingdom. Okay, and this is probably the most major theme of all, is the theme of king and kingdom. Okay, so Graham Goldsworthy, who is an Australian theologian and who's given a lot of his life and work to studying biblical theology. He's also a super cute little Australian man, old Australian man. So if you look him up on YouTube, you'll know what I'm talking about. But he says that God's kingdom looks like this: God's people living in God's place under God's rule. I'm going to say that again. God's people living in God's place under God's rule. He also kind of gives a picture of what the kingdom looks like in circles. He has 3 circles inside of each other. The outer circle is the land, God's land. Then you have the middle circle, which is the city of God. And then the center circle is the temple. And inside the temple is the king. Okay? So the kingdom as it was in Eden, that's where we're going to begin. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the earth and then the garden, and then placed man in the middle of the garden as his priest and the one who is to tend the garden. His intent was to lovingly rule over his creation and his people in perfect communion. Then a rival kingdom invaded, which was the serpent, and convinced Adam and Eve to rebel against their king. They were forced out of the garden, but God was not willing to leave it that way. He began a plan to restore them to his chosen land. We see that begin in chapter 12, when he promises Abraham to give them the land of Canaan. God, the king, was chasing after his people and working to bring them back to his place. We see the idea of the king come up again at the end of Genesis with Jacob's fatherly blessing to his son Judah, where he says, "A king is coming whom all nations will honor." There's foreshadowing at the beginning of, the beginning of the book of the Bible, or the beginning of the Bible. Okay? Then we have the kingdom in the promised land. So we've moved to the next section, the history section. Moses leads them into the land flowing with milk and honey. Now, obviously the land was not literally flowing with milk and honey, but it was a reference to remind them of Eden. So they're saying it was like Eden. And the people entered into that land, but they wanted to fit in with the nations around them. So instead of submitting to the king they had in God, they wanted a king of their choosing, Saul, which didn't work out for them very well. So then God gave them David, the king of his choosing. In 2 Samuel 7, David wanted to build a house for God, but God tells David that he wants to make a house from David, a dynasty. David wanted to be remembered or known for building the temple, but God basically told David, "I want you to be known for what I do through you." God wanted to establish a kingdom of justice and righteousness. David wrote in Psalm 89:14, "Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne." Okay, there's more kingdom language there. Because of Israel's continuous failures, then God raised up prophets to tell them about the coming kingdom. Okay? Then we move to the kingdom at hand. So we have 400 years of silence. Then God's kingdom comes through Mary in Matthew 1. But Jesus didn't really look like a king. He was not at all what they were expecting. And he didn't do what they expected their coming king to do. Instead, he showed us what his kingdom would look like through the miracles he did. Healing, kicking out demons, feeding the 5,000. It was less about making their lives better here and more about telling us what his eternal kingdom would look like. And when the king came, they didn't want him. All of those years waiting and longing for a king, and when he came, they rejected him. They didn't see, or what they didn't see, was that he did go to battle for them on the cross and fought an enemy they could not possibly defeat. And unlike earthly kings who send representatives to go before them, he represented his people. His kingdom is an upside down kingdom that does not look like the earthly kingdoms. When Jesus came, everything changed. Okay, then we have the kingdom as it is now, and we're looking at the rest of the New Testament. The kingdom today is where the king is. The kingdom spreads as the gospel is spread to all nations and all people. And this kingdom will never end. In Revelation 4:1-2, John was invited to see who was truly on the throne, or see Jesus on the throne as he is now. That's where he is now. And to go back to Graham Goldsworthy's circles with the land, the city, the temple, with the king inside the temple, now we see that with Jesus, the king and the temple are the same thing. Okay. And while we wait for the future kingdom, the Bible tells us, like in Colossians, like we studied last semester, how citizens of God's kingdom are to relate to one another. and how we know who is part of the true kingdom. Okay, then in Revelation, we have the kingdom as it will be. Revelation gives us a picture of what the kingdom will be when Jesus returns. It will consist of God's people from all of history and all of humanity. We will be living in God's land that is perfect and holy and good. And we will be under God's rule forever. But when we get there, or when it comes to us, the best thing about the kingdom will be that the king is there. Okay? That's the story of the Bible through the theme of kingdom. Okay? Okay, so how do you do this? So when I was growing up, my family, we would go visit my grandparents who lived in Houston, Texas. We would visit them every summer. And sometime during the time that we were there, we would always go to Galveston Beach. And my brother and I, one of our favorite things to do would be to find shark's teeth on the beach. We loved collecting them. And so we would just walk long stretches up and down the beach looking for shark's teeth. The various sizes, sometimes they were black, sometimes they were white, a mixture of both. You just kind of had to keep an eye out for this very specific shape. And the thing is, once I started looking for them and kind of trained my eyes to see them, I would quickly find them and found that I was subconsciously looking for them when I didn't even realize I was looking for them. So earlier in December, I went to Florida with some friends, and I was walking along the beach with one of the ladies I was with, and I caught myself scanning the sand looking for shark's teeth. I didn't even think about it. I was just doing it as we were walking because it's just kind of ingrained in me now to look for them. So I think that that's the same way as what happens to us when we start searching for these themes in the Bible. Once we start looking for them, we will just start noticing them and picking up on them as we're reading through the Bible. So the first thing you're going to need is a Bible. It can be a study Bible. You can use a Bible app on your phone with the search option. And a lot of times when I'm doing this, that's what I use because I like the ease of the search option. They also have the online Bibles, which would have the same features. You're going to need some sort of a concordance. It can be in print or online. We do have some suggestions on our research page. The Bible apps have a search where you can search certain words, and it'll give you scripture options for those. Okay, so the way that you'll begin is by searching for the obvious terms for the thing that you are looking for. So as far for kingdom, you would search king, kingdom, throne, some of these obvious words. And then you would maybe look at contrasting terms or kind of outside terms like maybe dominion, attack, invasion, those types of things. And you can use passages or stories that you already know that kind of highlight some of those things. You want to look up related words, okay? So you'll start by looking up some of these terms and words that you may know. It's helpful to use a thesaurus and get that out to help you kind of find some different words to maybe search for as you're looking for passages, okay? And you're going to want to, I would recommend beginning with Genesis, reading through Genesis chapters 1 through 3, and then Revelation 20 through 21, because that's where Genesis is where our themes are going to begin, and the end of Revelation is where they end, or where they kind of find their consummation. And so you could even start there, finding the beginning and then the end of that theme, and then use the story arc, the gospel story arc that we have on your resources page to kind of fill in the differences. So you can look in parts of Genesis 1 through 3 would already have kind of creation in the fall a little bit, but then you can start looking in, the history or the life of Christ is a really good place to kind of stop and see in his life what he did that fulfilled those themes or helped move them along, or in Christ, some of them changed, right? So in the Old Testament with the king and kingdom and the temple, they were two different things. And in Christ, they were the same thing. So there's some of that. That's the moving along of that theme. Okay? You can look at types of Jesus, things that point to Jesus, or even archetype, which means the opposite of Jesus. And we have a lot of those exemplified, especially in the Old Testament. Okay? And then you can, like I said before, look in the redemption part of the Bible, in Jesus's life, or because of what he did on the cross. How does that play a part in the theme? Okay? And then ending in consummation. And then maybe once you have, the beginning and the end, and maybe a couple passages from these two sections, then you can begin searching through the remaining genres or segments of the Bible, like we have listed here. Searching through those and maybe filling in gaps if you choose to. Okay? I would recommend choosing only one or two passages from each section. This is not an exhaustive story. You are not looking for every passage that has anything to do with the kingdom. Okay? You're only looking for one or two that move the storyline along. Okay? Does that make sense? This is where it gets tricky. And when you start searching, you're going to see all of these passages, and it's so easy to become overwhelmed. But that's not what we're doing. You're just picking out one or two. This is where the worksheet becomes handy. I'll pull it up and show you again. This, okay. The first thing you're going to want to do is write the theme that you're searching. And then we have it broken into law and history, wisdom and prophets, gospel and history in the New Testament, which is Acts, and then letters, and then prophecy and revelation. Okay? And remember that what you choose needs to move the story along. And once, because it'd be really easy to find passages that all are basically kind of saying the same thing. And you kind of want your next section to kind of be moving it along. And then at the very end of all of this, once you kind of have passages, try writing out the story of the Bible with that theme, which is what I just did with King and Kingdom. Or tell it to someone. If you don't want to write it out, tell it to someone. That's another great way to process that. Okay? I would recommend going slowly. Okay? It's not going to come natural for all of us. It is a new skill that we are learning. It is going to feel really overwhelming when you first sit down to do this, because this, for a lot of us, this isn't how we think. This isn't how we've ever really studied or approached the Bible before. But I promise you that by June, this is going to become much more natural. I promise you. So stick with us. Don't give up. Don't give up. And if you do find that you are getting really frustrated, or even after watching this video, you feel super overwhelmed, it's very possible I've not explained it well. Ask for help. I would recommend that ladies would get together and do it together and work together on this and study together. Because there's not one right answer. Okay, we may all come up with different passages that will tell the same basic story. But I promise, once you know how to spot these themes, like shark teeth on the beach, you'll begin to see them pop up as you read your Bible. And then we'll be able to use this tool as we study our Bible. Okay? I'll skip that. At our study, we did spend some time practicing together. I'm obviously not going to do that here online. But I would recommend at home, make a group if you need to. You do want to do one theme for every 2 weeks. Okay, we're going to give you 2 themes a month. And remember, we meet on the second Saturday of every month. So do 2 themes a month. We did make this, Chelsea made this so that way you could do like this box on Monday, this one on Tuesday, this one on Thursday, Wednesday, this one on Thursday, and then paraphrase it on Friday, if that's something that you need to do, that works for you. I know we're doing them not a whole theme in a week, but you can. This is go at your own pace. Whatever works best for you, do that, okay? But do be patient with yourself and give yourself time to learn to look at the Bible in this way, okay? In February, Chelsea is going to be leading us in February. And so the passages that we are looking at for next time, or not the passages, the themes that we're looking at for next time are lamb, sacrifice, substitute. That's all one. Lamb, sacrifice, substitute. And then the second theme that we're going to be looking at is nakedness, clothing. Okay, nakedness, clothing. So those are the 2 themes that you're going to work on from now until our next meeting in February. Okay, I also have a few book recommendations. I'll hold them up here. These are my copies, but you're welcome to borrow them and let me know if you want to go through any of them. This one is Biblical Theology. It's a really short, easy read. This is more about talking more about the storyline of the Bible and how it's all unified into one story. This one I highly recommend is from Nancy Guthrie, and this book has 9 chapters, and in each chapter she goes through one theme and tells a storyline in the Bible through one theme, okay? Don't cheat. If you have this book or you borrow this book, I would recommend not reading it or the chapters until after you've already kind of given it a whirl for yourself. Excuse me. Excuse me. Okay. And then I have some others. If you are quite the reader and really want to get in deeper, I have this one from Graham Goldsworthy called The Son of God. This is one of a series of lots of different themes that they've put together in telling the story of the Bible through different themes. This is the one I have. And then he also has 2 books. This one, Christ-Centered Biblical Theology, I tried reading over the summer. I've tried reading it a handful of times. I'm struggling to get through it because it's pretty heady. Definitely not a beach read. But if you like those kind of books, there's this one. This is going to be somewhat similar to that, according to plan, but is a much easier read, not quite as academic. So, but those are books that I have that kind of help bolster this idea of biblical theology and looking at the Bible as one story. So, okay, so that's what I have for you. I know that a lot of us want a step-by-step, do this, right answer type thing. That's not what this is. And I get that might begin to feel a little overwhelming. But if you feel that way, ask for help. I would be happy to sit down and work with you. Cassie Cochran would be happy to. Chelsea Cunningham would be happy to reach out to one of us and let us know if this is kind of a struggle for you. Once you get started and once you kind of get it going, I think you'll be just fine. Okay, so that is what we are doing this semester. We are going to be learning how to trace themes through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation using our handy-dandy resources. Okay, so again, let us know if you have any questions or if you need a binder. I'll be happy to get one to you. Thank you.